My name is Patrick Armstrong. I'm the Executive Director and the founder of the Dave Mounsey Memorial Fund. The Dave Mounsey Memorial Fund is a not-for-profit organization which donates life-saving defibrillators in the name of fallen law enforcement, fire, EMS, and military members who were killed in the line of duty. And we donate those defibrillators out into public spaces. As of today, we have donated 124 defibrillators, and we have several more already slated for later this year, once the COVID guidelines kind of slow down a little. Dave Mounsey was larger than life, and I get that some of that probably comes from him being gone almost 15 years and how we remember people. But really, Dave was the center of the room, and not in a boisterous, kind of negative way, but he was somebody who always had people laughing. He was British, so of course you had the accent, always worked for him. In fact, he used to hate, I would tell people he was from Tilsonburg and he just watched a lot of British shows and developed it on purpose. He didn't like that. But Dave was somebody who he cared about everyone he worked with, and he cared about the public. I can recall when Dave would put out a need to have somebody arrested because of public safety issues or what have you, fear for safety, Dave would call day in, day out on his days off. He wanted the victim to feel safe, and so he very much was dedicated to his job. Dave had served in the Royal Air Force. He then came over to Ontario. He was in Ontario Corrections and then became an officer with the Ontario Provincial Police and was a crisis negotiator. Very important, when we first started the Dave Mounsey Memorial Fund, we really focused on kind of Dave's service career. And it didn't take too long to realize that you can get that information anywhere. That doesn't tell you anything about somebody. That tells you what they did. You know, it doesn't tell you who they were. And although these careers, Air Force, corrections, policing, are very intensive careers and you throw yourself into them to be good at them, it still doesn't say who you are. So we developed very early explaining not just what Dave did, but who he was. And we've carried that forward with other donations so that we really get a sense of somebody was more than a mother or a father. They were a dedicated volunteer to their community. A young private who forgot to hug his mother, so in front of full view of all of his platoon mates, walks off the bus to hug his mother in front of everybody. An officer who is just totally devoted towards the welfare of animals. All those little nuances help bring these people to life, to share their story, because that's what our job is. And so when we talk about Dave, we no longer say, here's the cut and dry things that he was. We like to share that he had an infectious smile, that in Ottawa doing the police memorial, a ceremonial unit, Dave drinking at night, singing American Pie is probably one of the funniest memories I have, listening to a British man try to sing American Pie. So I truly believe that it is our duty of the living to tell the stories of those that have gone. Otherwise, they're just names on plaques. And nobody's a name on a plaque. Everybody is somebody that has lived, somebody that's laughed. And I think that it's important that we share that story so that the next generation know that person, and that way they truly live. In 2009, myself and some like-minded people got together and we sat down and wanted to do a tribute, not just to Dave, but to all fallen law enforcement, fire, paramedic, and military. A lot of organizations, especially at the time, were very specific to one of those things. And we wanted to incorporate all, because all of those professions have given their life for service to their province, to their country. So we sat down and we thought, what is something that we can do? And I had in mind defibrillators. The creation of the Dave Mounsey Memorial Fund, there were a couple elements that all worked at once. Definitely when I first came to Huron County, over the doorway was a picture of Senior Constable Bruce Crew. And then in 2006, April 22nd, Matthew Dinning was killed. I worked with Link Dinning, his father, and had spoken to Matthew about joining the forces, and Matthew joined the forces. He was in the Air Force. He was a military police officer and was killed overseas with 3 other persons because of an IED. And I remember Dave doing the death notification. When Dave's death happened later that year, there was already a number of things that had gone on. Trooper Mark Wilson from London had been killed over in Afghanistan as well. And when I look at John Atkinson, he was a Windsor police officer who was killed in the line of duty. And that was the last funeral that Dave and I attended as the ceremonial unit. So there was a lot of factors that went into the creation of the Dave Mounsey Memorial Fund, more so than just Dave. I mean, certainly it's named after him, so that's a significant factor. But there were a lot of other pieces that worked with that. And then in 2010, I was on shift when Vu Pham was murdered in Huron County, and was at the scene. And that was a motivating factor to keep going. In 2004, Dave was involved in a crash on duty. He was T-boned. He was driving down a through road, was T-boned, and his cruiser was put in the ditch. I was first on scene for that crash as well, as far as police went, and spent some time in the water. The fuel tank had ruptured with the cruiser, so I was doing my best with the limited skill sets I had, and there's not a lot you're going to do as a police officer standing in fuel-infested water. And it was the Blythe Fire Department who came and extracted Dave, and Dave was so impressed by those firefighters, those volunteer firefighters, that he actually ended up joining the Blythe Fire Department as a volunteer firefighter as well as a police officer. And we used to joke that he kind of got the best of both worlds. You know, when he'd show up in a police cruiser, maybe he wasn't as welcome, but when he'd show up in a fire truck, everybody wanted him there. So he really connected with those firefighters and what it is that those volunteers did. In 2006, Dave and his partner Brenda noticed that there was not a defibrillator with the Blythe Fire Department. And so Dave and Brenda, who were both avid runners, decided that they were going to run a marathon in British Columbia on Dave's 50th birthday, which was early October, and that they were going to raise the money to buy a defibrillator for the Blythe Fire Department. So Dave and Brenda went to British Columbia, they raised the money, they did their marathon run. Unfortunately, Dave was never able to see that defibrillator donated because the crash happened on October 14, 2006. Dave and I were working shift. We'd gone to a town for breakfast, and we were heading back, and we got a call for a rollover. It was unknown if there was any injuries, but it was kind of in the northern part of the county and in our zone. So we headed out, and where we left from in the south was sunny. And it being October in Canada, once we got north of a small town called Brussels, it was actually kind of sleet. And I remember one of Dave's last radio transmissions was telling me to slow down. So while we were en route, Dave lost control, single motor vehicle collision. His cruiser went across the road, went into the opposite ditch, and then hit a berm in the ditch, which then kind of launched his car into a telephone pole. Sheared the telephone pole right out. When I arrived on scene, I didn't even realize that it was missing a telephone pole. That's how forceful the impact was. So I get on scene, and I knew from previous careers and experiences with death and what have you that even though his eyes were open, that it wasn't going to be a recovery. They airlifted Dave out. A fellow officer and dear friend, Al, was with Dave in the helicopter, and they flew him out. He went to London, where over the next month, he was never able to recover. They were never able to bring him around. And so they brought him back to Huron County. His mother and father, Shirley and Colin and Brenda, they had to make that decision. On November 13th, he passed away from the injuries as a result from that collision. Absolutely, that crash it was a catalyst for me. I count 2007 to 2012 as 5 years of crisis. And of course, at the time, and people don't realize it, 2006 doesn't sound that far ago, but it really was in terms of the culture when it comes to trauma and trauma knowledge. So when I joined policing, I already had significant trauma collected from a childhood event, and I had trauma from a previous career, long-term exposure to traumas. So I was already kind of, my glass was already starting to fill up pretty significantly when it came to that. And Dave's death was definitely a catalyst to that. And anyone who knows me from that time period will tell you that I definitely was in some form of crisis. I think the problem is with things like depression, with things like anxiety, when you deal with, and I don't like the term PTSD because it's not a disorder. It's an illness or an injury, far more than it is a disorder. But when you're dealing with that, same with when you deal with addiction, it's really hard for people to find out where you start and where you stop and where the trauma injuries and where that happens. What happens is you tend to get grouped in that person has anger control, that person's an addict, that person's depressed, that person makes bad decisions, which was my forte in those 5 years of crisis, both professionally and personally. You can almost map it out. Every time I did something really good, you could guarantee within a certain amount of time, I do something that would really offset it just as importantly. And that sort of pattern, it's easy to fall into wanting to blame something. I'm still responsible for decisions and for things I've done and things I've said during times of crisis. I don't put it off onto anything else. I don't shrug my shoulders and say, well, I was in crisis. This is why I was feeling it. As a culture, we've definitely changed. We definitely talk about it now, and there's definitely more of an acceptance that it happens, but I think we're still lagging behind where we need to be for the acceptance for the fact that those bad things do happen. So when you deal with addictions, was it trauma that caused that addiction, or is it the person's genetic? Because same with depression and things like that. So to get that acceptance is different. I had a supervisor who was a severe alcoholic. He'd been involved in a police shooting a number of years before, and many people didn't know that. And again, that kind of goes back to trauma. I don't advertise, hey, here's all the things that I went through before Dave's crash, or even that, Dave's crash, so that everybody knows, oh, that guy went through something. But for this supervisor, it became a joke for other people to say, oh, so-and-so showing up drunk for work, we're gonna have to drive him home. So-and-so has a new bruise on his arm, wonder how he got that. What all of us, and myself included, we failed to see is that he's in crisis, and he was in crisis for over 20 years, and he was just surviving, existing. We still kind of play competition with trauma. We still go, when a young person says, hey, I have a real hard time with this call, there's still that generation that says, oh, well, you had a problem with that, I saw worse. And unfortunately, what we're doing is we're teaching that generation, just shut up and take it. What did you think you were getting into? And there has to be a certain element of emotional toughness in these careers, but we have to be able to reach out, and we have to be able to know that when we are struggling, we can say, hey, I have an issue. I look back to, I know earlier we had talked and you'd asked about, was I supported in the Dave Mounsey Memorial Fund in the creation? And 99% I was. 99%. In fact, I had a supervisor and I went up and said, hey, we're selling these memberships. They're $100 for a lifetime membership. She said, I'm in. Who do I make a check out? And then I suddenly realized we don't have a bank account. So then you're kind of going, if you could make it out to me, please. So definitely have the support for somebody to trust. Yeah, here's a $100 check. I hope you're going to put it to where you say. I did overhear two supervisors of mine that I respected quite highly at the time and still do. They didn't know I was in the detachment, and they were talking about how Patrick isn't going to get through one defibrillator. And I remember being so mad, so upset, like how could they not support me? So a couple years later, both those people ended up coming to events. They ended up paying whatever it was to come to the event. So between the two of them, they paid for a sixth of a defibrillator. So I thought, hey, I won. Look at that. I look at it now and where I am now in my healing, and I think they weren't bashing me. They were bashing where I was. And our terminology wasn't there in 2009 to say crisis, or this person's in crisis. Culturally, we weren't there. But what they were saying to each other is, Patrick's still not where he needs to be. I don't know if this is going to be successful. And I think that they wanted to make sure that I was going to be successful, and that I certainly wasn't going out there and putting Dave's name on the line and my name on the line and have it fail. So I've come a long way from where I really held on to some anger with that to where I am now, and I realize that's not what it was. When we found out about the first life save, which actually was 7 years ago, just a couple days ago, it was pretty awe-inspiring to know that something that you put in 20 hours a week and all volunteer and all the stuff that you did, somebody was saved by it. And I'm not somebody who uses the expression, if one person can be saved, then it's all worth it, because I don't believe anything is worth the loss of the men and women whose names we've donated or the names that we haven't got to yet. But I can say that the time we put into this organization, we saved a life. And then 2 years later, the second life save came from the same defibrillator, which was remarkable. And then almost 2 years later that day, we had a third life save. So that makes all the time and effort worthwhile. I would hope that Dave, I'm sure he's laughing and quite enjoying that his name gets said so often. I told his mother once that I think I've officially written his name more often than he may have, before I realized that you could buy envelopes that had pre-done stamps. So I hope that he's proud, that he's remembered by so many people, and his name is attached to so many other fallen first responders and so many military persons. We've donated right back to the War of 1812 for HMS Star. We have Huron County's first fallen first responder, John Miller, who was a firefighter who was killed in 1890. The first woman killed in the line of duty in law enforcement was Margaret Mick, who was a corrections officer, and she was killed at the women's jail in Toronto in the 20s, I believe. I hope that that's how he would view it, that he would be proud of all of the board members that we have had who have given their all, and all of our supporters and all of our volunteers. We've had everything from motorcycle rides to a golf tournament to run around the square to Dancing with the Stars of the OPP to Dancing with the Stars of 911. And all of these events are possible only because of hardworking board members and volunteers. I guess I've almost had 15 years to wonder. It's hard when you go through trauma where you live and somebody else doesn't. You very much play around with it should have been me, and that's a hard thing to accept, that you're alive, they're not. You know, I should have been the lead cruiser. If I hadn't taken so long dicking around in my car, I would have been ahead of him. And maybe that should have been me and not him. But it's a dangerous game to play because you can't change that. And I played that game many times, especially during that 5 year, that it should have been me. And in fact, when you're going through crisis, a lot of times when people go, well, how come you can be angry? How come you're addicted to things? How come you're making bad decisions? You don't realize that when you don't think you're worthwhile, you don't make decisions that are worthwhile, because why would you make good decisions when they'd be wasted on you because you don't think you're worth good decisions? And it's kind of a self-defeating system of thought, but it's there. I guess I would tell them that I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't have done better. I think type A personalities, we're used to solving problems and we're used to fixing things. And I couldn't fix them. It was beyond my skill set. And I would tell them I'm sorry. Don't really think of what the legacy of the Dave Mounsey Memorial Fund would be. As long as we're still doing events that people will come to, I guess pay to come to, we're still raising money. There's always going to be a need for defibrillators in public, and there's always going to be a need to remember those that have gone before us. So as long as those factors are there, I don't necessarily see what the legacy, other than we're just going to keep donating defibrillators, and maybe we donate 10 a year, maybe we donate 5 a year, but as long as there's still a need and as long as we're still able to keep raising funds. Sadly, the list of fallen law enforcement, fire, paramedic, and military members is extensive, and every one of those men and women deserves to be recognized and deserves to be remembered. So not really thinking what the legacy is going to be. We've been around 11, almost 12 years, and we're still going strong, and I want to see it continue, and we'll just keep plugging away. I think I'm too stubborn to give up now. So